So I just recorded a devlog that ended up being like 40 minutes long, and I figured that's just a little too long. So we're back with more devlog goodness. So what do we have here? We have my computer build, but you might notice that it looks a little different from usual. So let's go over the changes to my character model first. We'll come back to the actual like look and feel difference that we see in front of us here in a moment. But I spent the last 2 weeks on stream remodeling my player character. And this is the end result. There's two of them. There's one very high poly version that's 4.5 million vertices. And then we've got this lower poly version with about 100,000, which is still way, way more than is altogether necessary and optimal. And I might go back and change that later on. But this is the final version which I'm going to be using to animate, and then like swapping out things for like a lower poly version of the model later on. Shouldn't be a big deal if I decide to do that, because everything would just map to the same like skeleton anyway. If you want to see more about how I made this, there's about 4 hours of footage of me actually making this step by step, just going through trial and error, making this entire thing. And I'm pretty happy with it. So it does look slightly different from the design that we've all gotten used to over the past couple of months, which is this one. Don't mind the whole shading thing. Again, we'll get into it immediately after this. Don't worry. It does look very different, right? It's definitely still the same character. It's definitely a different take on this character. I think it's more of a modern take. This design, or this implementation of the design, rather, really screams like PlayStation 2 to me. And that's definitely not a bad thing, because that's kind of like the era and the feel I'm going for, especially like with this new cell shader as well. I'm definitely going for like a PS2 GameCube era type feel. So this model doesn't necessarily not work. I think the new model will, once I get more used to it, be nicer, personally. On top of that, the issue I had with the old model, which this one doesn't have, is that the old model was made up of, you might be able to see it, maybe? I don't think it's in this project anymore, never mind. It was made up of a couple of different separate pieces of geometry, like the scarf was separate, and then the arms were separate, and then the legs were separate, and in the game itself, you can actually, let's see, in the game itself, you can actually see that the legs are, I mean, sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. The legs aren't quite connected to the body. It's really difficult to notice, but it's definitely noticeable. And when I start doing more animation to make the custom animations that are just like custom made for the game rather than stock animations, I'm going to add a lot more stretching and squashing. And what I don't want to have happen with that is limbs detaching, which will happen a lot when things are not one continuous mesh. In this, it's one continuous mesh. So that was the main reason that I remodeled the character. And then I ended up like with a couple of design changes as well. So having gone through that, I think it's about time we start talking about the new shading, because you can see here is we have lines drawn around edges, and things are shaded in like these bands. Things are being, technically you could say it's cell shaded. Actually, technically you can't say it's cell shaded because it's post-processing. You can just turn it off, and this is what it looked like before. This is what it looks like now. It's a post-processing material, which we'll get into real quick here. So this is the material which I will maybe, together with a couple of other assets, at some point put up on the Unreal Market store for people to use if they want to. This is mostly, especially like this left part over here, is mostly based on a tutorial that I followed from the Unreal YouTube channel, which you can check out and link down below in the description if I don't forget to add it. I'll go over what it does real quick. We have two different type of like line drawers. we have the depth lines and the normal lines, which effectively work the exact same. So I'm going to explain only the top one, and then I'll go over the bottom one real quick. So what we have here is for the right, left, and down and up, they do the exact same thing. You might be wondering, what do they do? Well, for every pixel on the screen, they compare its depth from the camera compared to the pixel right of it, the pixel left of it, the pixel on top of it, and the pixel on the bottom of it. And based on what that returns, it will either draw a black pixel or it will not if they're too close together. Which the sensitivity for that is done through this multiplier and this bias. And that's everything there is to it. Then we have a variable here which influences line thickness. I've got it set to 3. So instead of doing that for 1 pixel, it does that for 3 pixels to each side. And I think it returns the average of the 3 pixels. So it can return gray pixels as well with the way I've got it set up right now. I should check into that to make sure that's actually the case. But I think it can do that, which is either good or bad depending. So then we have the same setup here for the normals. And the normals is pretty much just like the way a face in your model is facing. Because you can have, like, this is a flat surface, right? So usually you would assume that the normal would do this. But through use of normal maps, which is a 2D image that you can put on top of this, you can tell, well, this part of the face is like pointing that way, and this part of the face is pointing that way. And through that, you can fake depth. And that's a really good way to create more detailed models without having to resort to high amounts of geometry. And a normal map is a lot cheaper to calculate for your GPU than a lot of geometry is. So that's why we use those. And I think in Unreal Engine 5, like high poly models are a lot more optimized. So a lot of things will be able to be done through actual geometry rather than normal mapping, as far as I understand, but I haven't really looked too much into that yet. So that's what normal maps do. And I'll get back into that in a moment, actually. So that's what all that does, and then we add those two together, and then we have all the lines being drawn on screen like this. So again, before and after. Then this part over here, it does the cell shading, and it doesn't really do the cell shading. In short, what this does is this little section of nodes over here just increases the contrast of the rendered image, which is without the post-processing. So this is just the normal rendered image that the engine puts out. It still has to make that. So all the more gradient colors and more complicated calculation that it has to do to make this still have to be done. The fact that it ends up looking more simple doesn't mean it's easier to run. As a matter of fact, it has to first render this and then process all of this on top of it. So it is actually more difficult to run, even though it looks more simplistic. That's the wrong material. So what this does is it ups the contrast like a lot, and then through this flooring node, which just takes a value and rounds it down to the nearest integer, it creates this banding effect that you can see here, right? The same thing you might see if you have a very compressed JPEG image, for instance, of a gradient, where you can see like banding start to exist because it just doesn't have enough like grayscale values. I'm artificially creating that here by taking my output, multiplying it by a variable number, flooring that output. Again, it does this for each pixel on the screen individually, and then dividing by that same number again. That way, pixels get grouped into, in this case, 6 different bands, 6 different tones, 6 different grayscale values, 6 different, you get the point, right? So I think for this specific one, I've increased the amount from 6 to like 20 something. 12. So it's got a range of 12 different bands from pure white to pure black. And then we just have a node setup that blends that version of the render with the original version of the render. Because if you don't do that, things are very, very dark and not particularly playable. So we can go PC Hub World and we can put this blend. If we put this B to 1 and this to 1 as well. This is what it ends up looking like, which is just very, very dark. If you play through it, it's very dark. It has a stupid amount of contrast. It just doesn't look good at all. So what you do to fix that is you go back here, you blend things together a little bit. You have to play on a pretty per level basis with it, and you end up with a normal render of the scene, and then all the cell shading is added on top of that. So it ends up making things a little bit brighter. It also means that you don't have to put all your lighting up as high, because you're effectively exposing your scene twice. And because light is an additive process, you still end up with that banding, right? Because if you have a area that has a gradient from 0 to 1, which ends up with 6 bands, there's still going to be a little bit more gradient here, as you can probably see like here. There is some gradients to every single one of these bands. It's very subtle, but it is there. But the banding itself is so much more in your face that just kind of takes over and creates the cell shaded look. So that's a very short recap what this entire thing does. And then we have a distance mask to make sure that it doesn't draw the lines up until infinity, because the lines being drawn are not taking perspective into account. It just takes the pixels on screen as they are and draws, like in this case, 3 more pixels worth of line around it. So if something is very far away, it looks like the outlines are a lot thicker than things that are closer by. They're not. They're the exact same thickness, but that's the issue, is your brain perceives that as being farther away, that over there. So if it has the same thickness, surely that means in reality, physically, it is thicker, but that's just a trick your brain will play on you. So that's the cell shader, and then I also made a fog shader for the actual hub world. How long have I been recording for? 12 minutes. Okay, so let's go over the new part of the level that I've made real quick. If I can find it, level computer world 3D. I finished this section over here with a couple more wall jumps. I haven't finished it because I've actually changed the wall jump mechanics a little bit. I was fucking about with... this is a better view of what the character will look like in actual gameplay. I was fucking about with a friend of mine in this level, and he discovered an exploit where he could chain wall jumps together, which obviously like wasn't great because it was really easy to abuse. So that's part of the reason that I'm doing all of these paths as being separate mechanics, right? Because if you have to use one mechanic over and over and over again, the chance of finding out how you can abuse it is a lot bigger. So this is the path that makes use of wall jumping. Then that path over there is just like the normal platforms that you jump from one to the next. Can I make this? Can I make this? I can. And then the new path I've made over here is all about rotating platforms, which I will go over real quick in a moment as well. This needs a little bit more work because the way I ended up fixing the wall jumping issue is through making the horizontal jump a lot longer from a wall jump while making the vertical jump a little bit less. So you used to like wall jump a bit like that, and now you wall jump a little bit more like that. That's very exaggerated. So that fixes that. And then we have, doing this with mouse and keyboard is really difficult. Then we have this, which is all about rotating platforms. So we had some rotating platforms and we had some literal, like just things that rotate. I need to put some obstacles on that to make it a little bit more difficult, but I haven't been able to do that yet. Then we have these two platform rotators that rotate like into each other. And I'll just show you the rest. I don't need to play through it. Then you get to this section where you can jump on these huge platforms. There will be a little bit of a reward if you go through this more difficult section. There needs to be a little bit more like action going in this area because this is kind of dull to walk through. Then you're blocked from just staying on these platforms until the end. So you're forced onto this. Then you come here and you end up in Mario Sunshine. I'm not even going to pretend like this isn't taken straight out of that, but it's a really fun version of a block to just walk over and do stuff with. From there, you make your way to the end, but you can also make your way up through these rotators on top of here, which will have a different collectible for you to get. And then there is also this over here. And this is actually a pretty fun one. And the easiest way for me to showcase that is playing from here, I think. Because there's going to be an optional collectible on that platform over there as well. I almost died. But it's really difficult, not impossible, mind you. So for speedrunners' sake, this is going to be a very fun one. But it's very difficult once you've made it here to make it back to the end. So really what this says is when you get over here, you get your optional collectible, you go back and you have to like go around this section a whole like other time. Again, it is technically possible, especially if you use a wall jump like that, to do this. I'm not going to change that because it's actually pretty difficult to do that. So my philosophy of if a exploit, I don't think there's an exploit, if an exploit is difficult to pull off and not necessarily even very repeatable in other sections of the game, it's just because that specific obstacle has a little bit of leeway. If a player manages to do that, they're fucking earned the right to have that little bit of a skip. So that's everything there is to this level. There's going to be one more path here with some AI enemies that I still need to program. We'll get into that when I've actually made them. And then we can go through, finish this video off real quick by going through the hub world. Because this is the map that actually looks the best with the new cell shading. I've had to redo all of the lighting for this area because the way it looked with the like couple of lights that I had installed to begin with wasn't great. So I have taken away the exponential height fog, so there's no more god rays. Things are a lot more cartoony. And there's a lot more flat colors that are only getting detailed through lighting information, right? So this is only, like, if you go into this unlit, it's just solid green. And the dirt is just solid brown. And the sand is just, like, solid yellow. It's only got detailing due to all the lighting information here. And that's where we get back to the normal maps. What I explained about, like, a flat surface having some more detail added onto it through a normal map, which is kind of like a lighting texture. That's also what's going to give, for instance, these trees a little bit more detailing, because as far as like actual like images go, this doesn't have an image texture. This has a one solid color as a texture. But when we go to lit mode, this is a very bad example for a tree to show. Let me find a different tree that's a little bit more lit. Here, for instance, right? You can see there's a lot of detailing, but there is no geometry there to provide that. That's a normal map. And the way you most easily make that is you make a more high poly version of the model that you've sculpted with like grooves and creases and stuff like that. You overlay that one-to-one with the more low poly version that you're going to use in the game, and you say, generate a normal map. And then it generates a normal map based on the difference between the two models. So you do that, you apply that normal map to your model like this, and suddenly you have depth information. So lighting can do different things and add detailing to your objects. And that's where a lot of the detailing and a lot of the objects in my game is going to come from. And that has one huge upside. And that is this tree would usually need a number of different texture maps. You have a normal map, you have a roughness map, you have a albedo map, which is just like the image texture. You have a lot of different maps. And for the most part, that's not going to be necessary in this game. For the most part, like at least half the objects in this game, I imagine, are only going to require a normal map, just due to the art style consideration that I've made. Meaning that there's going to be a lot less video memory required to run the game. Still, the actual calculating that the GPU has to do is still decently intensive because things are probably not going to be very well optimized, especially with lighting and stuff like that. But you don't need a lot of video memory, which is also a huge ass bottleneck. Which then in turn means that I can maybe sometimes like use a 4K texture instead of a 2K texture to make things look a little bit better, to make up for that as well. So anyway, yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Normal maps. I said earlier in the video that I would talk about that, and then I almost forgot. So this is what the game at the moment looks like as far as like art style goes. The art style is obviously very much inspired by games like The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, which is a very famously cel-shaded cartoony game. To a certain extent, also A Hat in Time, which is one of my favorite games ever, really. I really love that game. It's a little bit less aggressive on the cel shading as far as I remember. I need to replay that game specifically for art style considerations, but also partly gameplay considerations. I assume is going to give me some ideas as well. But the art style is a lot less aggressive with the cel shading than I have it right now in A Hat in Time, I believe. Wind Waker is pretty aggressive with it, and I quite like that. So I'm going to have my game probably end up somewhere in between. I forgot to put a light in here. Can you tell? So yeah, this is what the game looks like right now, and you might say it's a downgrade because it doesn't look as fancy with like lighting effects and guard rays, and like there is no detail in the grass, and there will definitely be a little bit more detail in the grass than just solid green, I'm thinking, but I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with that yet. I also made this new path. I don't know if I've showed that off on video yet to the PC hub world area. And I just really like the look of it. Like just stand still here for a moment. Like actually, let's stand still here for a moment. This just looks great, right? I really personally love the way this looks. Like this is probably gonna be the thumbnail of the video. I'm not gonna lie. This is not 100% the way I see it in my mind when I imagine the final game, but it's pretty damn close. I really like the way this looks. You might have also noticed, by the way, that the actual materials for the character are also flat colors now, rather than having detailing in them. And that is because, as you can see right here, for anybody that's like, but detail is important. Yeah, this is what happens when you use more realistic textures with this shader. And that is, as long as things are relatively light, they manage. The moment they get more dark, they kind of get fucked up. Like the darker parts of the sandstone just don't look great anymore, right? So what I'm going to end up doing to make textures, because I'm not a great artist myself. I barely am an artist, I'd say. But what I can do is take image textures, make them tileable. I can just take photos of things myself when I have the capability to. Make them tileable, and then trace those with my drawing tablet. That gives me more control over things like depth information. I can probably make normal maps out of like a black and white map as well. I'd need to look up how to exactly do that, but I think I can do that as well. And then I can probably just make the actual texture itself mostly just yellow and just add in some depth information. Maybe a crack here or there that I just like manually draw in. And you have your cartoony sandstone. Again, I think a lot of the the actual detailing is going to come from lighting information. Most of the actual objects are going to be solid colors, more or less. So I'm very curious to see how things develop as we go along, but I am over the fucking moon with this new shader and this new art style and this look, and it's going to make things a little bit more difficult because obviously you don't have as readily available textures and stuff like that for more cartoony things, whereas if you just want to download materials from like Quixel, for instance, because I'm working on Unreal, those are all very realistic and I can't use those anymore. So I'm going to have to make things manually a lot more than I otherwise would have. But I only think that for a game like this, with the inspirations that I have, it doesn't make sense for things to look realistic. Things look cartoony in my mind when I think about this game. And now finally when I open Unreal itself, they also look cartoony. So the next big step in that is also having the animations look more cartoony with a lot more stretching and squashing going on. And that's probably what I'm going to be working on next, as well as developing a couple more AI enemies. Once those two things are both implemented, that being AI enemies and a more cartoony style, I'm probably going to end up pushing a new build to some people to just like let them play through it. The original 2 levels that were in the original build are not going to be in that anymore. So this temple up here and the other one all the way down there somewhere aren't going to be functional, because those levels they just don't work that well anymore. The checkpoints in them don't work anymore because I kind of broke those. That's a whole other story. Doesn't really matter. And that's not going to be what the game is like anymore in the future. So sometime in probably like May or June is when you can expect realistically the next build, because I'm making very slow progression with things, but I am very excited to get to share more of this. So this time we maintain things to be under half an hour rather than like 40 some minutes. I'm gonna end it here. Next week will likely be an animation stream again, either that or I will be modeling the robot character that I want to make, because that's also going to be a lot of fun. Or maybe it'll be a devlog if I actually manage to like make some progress with things like AI. We'll see. Until then, subscribing and stuff. You know how this works.